Westminster Abbey, 1308. Beneath the vaulted arches heavy with centuries of incense and empire, a child took her first steps into womanhood, not through choice, but by decree. Isabella of France stood barely taller than the altar candles. At only 12 years old, her frame trembled beneath a ceremonial gown stitched with threads of gold, layers upon layers making it nearly too heavy to walk in. A jewelled coronet bit into her scalp, its gleam hiding the anxiety in her eyes. Watching her from behind veiled expressions were the English nobility, the French envoys, the eyes of Europeal, assessing the value of this royal bargain. Her groom, Edward II, stood 24 and visibly disengaged. Handsome by some accounts, distant by all. He looked not upon Isabella, but beyond her, scanning the crowd as though searching for someone else. In truth, his affections lay elsewhere with Piers Gaveston, his controversial favourite. But court ceremony demanded appearances, and so the king performed his part, uttering vows to a foreign girl who spoke little English and even less of her own heart. This union was not a culmination of love, but a transaction of power between England and France. Philip IV, Isabella's father, cold-eyed and calculating, saw in the marriage a chance to anchor French interest within English soil. For Edward, it was a diplomatic concession, an olive branch to mend mounting tensions over land and sovereignty. For Isabella, it was the end of childhood. Amidst the grandeur golden drapes, the low drone of Latin prayers, rosewater scatterings across polished stone, there was no celebration in her spirit. She was a bride and a bargaining piece, draped in beauty but stripped of autonomy. The days that followed offered little solace. Her French retinue was dismissed, her familiar objects replaced with ceremonial symbols of a new role she hadn't chosen. She smiled when asked to, bowed when commanded, each gesture sculpted by obligation. In portraits of the time, she appears still and regal, but it is the stillness of someone frozen, not serene. Behind courtly beauty lay a more tragic reality. Isabella had been exported, like a dowry or a treaty clause in echo of her father's will rather than a voice of her own. The wedding, though resplendent in spectacle, marked a silent extinguishing. No trumpets could drown the shattering realization. In exchange for a crown, she had forfeited her place as a daughter, a child, and at least for now herself. The ceremony was over, the vows taken, the crown placed upon her head. What came next for the 12-year-old Queen of England was no fairy tale. When Isabella crossed the Channel from France to her new home, it was not husband, court, or kingdom that welcomed her. It was cold protocol and quiet suspicion. Her French attendants were quickly dismissed, a subtle but potent severing of her roots. Familiar faces, voices, comforts gone. Even her toys, trappings of girlhood, were deemed unsuitable for an English queen or wean, and left behind. She entered English court not as a bride eagerly embraced, but as a political offering now expected to perform. The court at Westminster shimmered with ceremony, but throbbed beneath with menace. Isabella sat among golden columns and heraldic banners, adorned in gowns too heavy for her slender frame, but none of it belonged to her. Every move watched, every letter censored. She spoke, and words travelled scrutinized by whispering advisers, recorded by spies loyal not to her, but to the king and his circle. Edward II remained distant, often absent when physically present, emotionally marooned. Any small gestures of affection she extended were rarely returned. She was too foreign for English sensibilities, yet not powerful enough in her own right to command loyalty. Banquets were held in her honour, yet the seat next to hers sat empty Edward, preferring the company of his favourite, Piers Gaveston, and later, Hugh Despenser. She learned quickly to endure these absences with grace and silence. Isabella's daily life became a performance, a queenly presence that masked the void within. Her rooms were ornate, her maids obedient, but she was never alone without being observed. Even her private chambers felt like gilded cage elegant. Yes, but imprisoning. Conversations in the court became exercises in diplomacy and decoding. Genuine connection was rare, trust rarer still. She became sharp-eyed, quiet not out of shyness but necessity. She began to see how words could wound or elevate, and how power glinted not only in crowns, but in whispered alliances, facial expressions, and acts of omission. This chapter of her life, though void of dramatic confrontation, refined her like fire. The golden cage taught Isabella how to read a room, how to conceal pain behind politeness, and how to play a game that would one day become her own. It was the beginning of her transformation from a decorative accessory of the throne into a calculating survivor of it. And while the court saw a girl robbed of childhood, they missed what was being born in the shadows, the mind of a future queen who would no longer wait to be noticed. Isabella's early years as Queen of England were not just shaped by the loneliness of a foreign court, but by a presence that eclipsed her entirely, Piers Gaveston. To the young queen, he appeared not only as an interloper, but as the favoured tenant of her husband's heart, and perhaps more. Gaveston's return from exile, orchestrated by Edward II shortly after their wedding, marked the beginning of Isabella's first public dishonour. She watched as her husband welcomed Gaveston with affection and exuberance that she, the crowned queen, had yet to receive. At court, Gaveston moved like a peacock in full plume. Dressed in silks paid for by the royal treasury, wearing jewels once gifted to Isabella, he flaunted the king's adoration as though it were a cloak of invincibility. The courtiers whispered, the nobles scowled, but none dared lenge the king's devotion to his favourite. Isabella, however, had no such luxury. Forced to share the dais at feasts with Gaveston seated beside the king, the message was unambiguous. She would take her place behind Edward's pleasure. The insult became unbearable when Gaveston began openly mocking her. Nicknaming her the French wench, he dismissed her as a spoiled distraction, ridiculing her accent, her youth, her foreign customs. The slights weren't just verbal. Edward handed over entire estates meant for Isabella's dowry to Gaveston. Trinkets sent from France, gifts from her father and mother, were found adorning the flamboyant favourite. What should have symbolised alliance between nations was instead handed to a man who paraded about the court with calculated arrogance. For a girl of 15, this wasn't merely a matter of jealousy. It was a tutorial in the brutal calculus of court life. Affection was leveraged as power, and status could be stripped away with a nod. Isabella began to observe, catalogue, and remember. Every whisper, every slight glance shared between Edward and Gaveston nothing escaped her now. While still cloaked in the gold-fringed trappings of her queenship, she realised her position was ornamental, not operational. Edward's neglect was not born of dislike. It was born of disdain, cloaked in distraction. And Gaveston? He was the blade in Edward's hand, smiling, dancing and slicing her authority without drawing blood where it could be seen. So Isabella began to retreat inward, burying her fury beneath finely embroidered silence. But the humiliation seeded something deeper. The understanding that love in royal chambers was often a pretense, and when power was denied, it had to be reclaimed, not requested. The sheen of Isabella's crown had barely dulled when the state's expectations for her shifted from queen to womb. At around 15, after years in marital limbo, their union was finally consummated, not out of romantic awakening, but necessity. Edward II, distracted by his political entanglements and unwavering devotion to his favourites, had delayed the dynastic duty that came with royal marriage. But pressures from both English and French courts grew impossible to ignore. France wanted its influence legitimised through a future king, and England needed stability in uncertain times. Isabella's body, still barely matured, became a subject of court scrutiny. Physicians and midwives intruded upon her most private self, tasked with determining her fertility like one might examine a prized broodmare. State interest in her biology superseded any personal comfort. These bureaucratic intrusions became ritual, regimented diets, scheduled prayers, even astrological consultations, all in service of urging forth an heir. At 17, Isabella bore a son, Edward of Windsor, the future Edward III. There was celebration, of course. Bells rang, nobles toasted, and for a fleeting moment, Isabella stood at the centre of adoration. Painted portrait, eights cast her as serene Madonna, cradling the boy who would ensure English continuity. To the world, she was triumphant, a queen who had fulfilled her purpose. But behind the chamber doors, the triumph was short-lived. Young Edward was swiftly taken from her, sequestered by wet nurses and courtiers who now deemed his upbringing a matter of national security. Isabella, both mother and queen, was denied the intimacy of sunlight warming her child's cheeks or the sound of his first words. Her son had become not hers, but England's. In that moment, she came to understand her position fully not sovereign consort, but a vessel, valuable only when delivering what the crown required. Her personal joy was buried beneath protocol, her maternal instincts stifled by political necessity. Even letters requesting glimpses of her infant son were rerouted or ignored, and Edward II, indifferent, scarcely permitted her a voice in the child's shaping. He remained cloistered in the affections of Hugh Despencer, who by now held greater sway over the king than his own son or queen. Yet, through this invisible agony, Isabella began to change. Her sorrow hardened into insight. She saw England's hierarchy not just as a system, but as an anatomy of power, one that gorged itself on queens, but listened to mothers who dared become stateswomen. And with that, the queen, once content with duty, began to transform into something much more formidable. The corridors of power in England grew colder for Isabella after the death of Piers Gaveston. For a time, she dared hope her husband might grow closer to her, that with Gaveston gone, space would be made for her to matter again. But that hope was cruelly short-lived. Into the vacuum stepped Hugh Despencer, the young man, not of flamboyance like Gaveston, but of ruthless ambition and darker design. Where Gaveston had humiliated Isabella with careless jests, Despencer menaced her with strategy. He did not need to mock her in public. He made her invisible in court and vulnerable in private. Despencer's rise was swift and suffocating. Unlike Gaveston, whose arrogance alienated the nobility, Despencer played the long game. He embedded himself not just in Edward's affections, but in the mechanisms of governance, acquiring lands, many of them formerly Isabella's, and asserting influence across the realm. With each acquisition of power came a removal of Isabella's rights. Her dower lands seized under dubious legal arguments, her household thinned, her movements curtailed. What began as marginalization turned into confinement. Her once ceremonial role as queen consort drifted into pure symbolism. The court around her became hostile terrain. Messages she sent were intercepted, appointments cancelled without notice, allies silenced. Even those loyal to her feared open association. Isabella's world tightened like a noose, each cord pulled taut by Despencer's iron hand. She was watched constantly, even in prayer. Servants reported her words. Desp, Ence's agents attended even the most trivial of meetings. Her ability to advocate for her son, Edward, was denied. She became a mother without influence, a queen without a voice. But isolation did not quell her, mind it sharpened it. Isabella, once reactive, now began to observe. She listened carefully, mapped allegiances, and noted every shift of loyalty at court. She understood now. Survival lay not in appealing to her husband, but in undermining the fortress being built around him. In public she remained composed, curtsying with practiced elegance, praising her husband's decrees through a clenched smile. But behind her cool gaze, a blueprint of resistance was being quietly drawn. It was during this time that the seed of rebellion truly planted itself in her spirit. Not as a tantrum of the scorned, but as the calculus of a queen. The golden crown that once smothered her now served as a mask for something far more dangerous: resolve. And in that cold palace, where power snarled behind velvet curtains and chapel walls, Isabella began to prepare for what none suspected from the once quiet Queen Defiance. The cold stone corridors of the English court had long felt like a prison to Isabella Hos, of laughter never her own, windows shadowed with suspicion. But in 1325, a flicker of opportunity emerged. Under the guise of diplomacy, Isabella was sent to her homeland, now ruled by her brother Charles IV, to negotiate peace over Gascony. It was a mission bestowed with Truster, so Edward II believed. What he failed to see was that Isabella had become more than a dutiful consort. She had observed, endured, learned. As soon as her feet touched French soil, the masks of loyalty and subservience began to fall. Paris welcomed her, not as a discarded wife, but as a returning princess. In her brother's court, Isabel transformed. Freed from the icy grip of the Despensers, her posture straightened, her gaze sharpened. Dressed no longer in drab English mourning silk, she wore rich blue and crimson colours of Capetian royalty, and for the first time in years, a genuine smile traced her lips. At court, whispers swirled. The she-wolf, newly emboldened, spoke with clarity and conviction. She condemned the Despencer's tyranny and Edward's neglect not with bitterness, but with regal precision. Diplomats listened, nobles leaned closer, and slowly, the outline of a new Isabella emerged not merely wronged, but ready. Her brother Charles, initially cautious, soon recognized her political value. He provided her with patronage, and more crucially, with protection. Meanwhile, Isabella began forming quiet alliances with disaffected English lords living in exile. Among them, Roger Mortimer. Their connection stirred scandal and songs, but beneath the romantic fascination lay strategic brilliance. Mortimer was no court peacock, was a warrior, a tactician, a man displaced by Despencer's treachery. Together, they found a shared cause and a shared grief. Their meetings, at first cautious, blossomed into a radical partnership. With Isabella's royal legitimacy and Mortimer's military savvy, they became a force capable of challenging the English crown itself. This wasn't sedition, it was reinvention. Isabella redefined her image from powerless queen to protector of England's future. In speeches and letters, she called herself the mother of the heir. She spoke not of rebellion, but of salvation, of restoring true kingship for her son and remedying the corrupted court that had stolen her marriage, her lands, and her voice. By the time her ships were prepared, Isabella was unrecognizable. Gone was the trembling girl in golden brocade. Standing in her place was a poised sovereign in armour-lined velvetise, narrowed, resolve unshaken. The journey ahead would be treacherous, but as her fleet set sail toward England's shores, Isabella no longer ran from fate. She was steering it. Paris had changed Isabella. Gone was the frightened queen, burdened by rejection and surveillance. In her place stood a woman restored by a taste of autonomy, sharp, minded, alert, and patient. Amid the glitter of the French court, where her brother Charles IV offered official niceties and her aunt Marguerite lent a comforting presence, Isabella found someone entirely different in Roger Mortimer, a man whose rebellion mirrored her own. Mortimer was not merely a disaffected noble. He was a reminder that England had not forgotten its outrage. Recently escaped from the grim Tower of London, where he had been imprisoned by the Despensers, Mortimer was tarnished and tenacious. His fury toward Edward II was personal, rooted in betrayal and vengeance. But what set him apart from the countless others disillusioned with the king was his capacity for patience and his ability to see Isabella not as a tool, but as an equal. Their meeting was no sweeping court romance, but a collision of experience and pain. Together they shared a vision and a wound. Both had been imprisoned, humiliated, stripped of their power and dignity. Now, in exile, they whispered late into candlelit nights. Their relationship walked the jagged line between political calculation and growing intimacy. The affair scandalized some, even later historians, but in that moment, it was logical rebellion. Mortimer needed legitimacy. Isabella needed force. Together, they forged an unlikely but indomitable alliance. Isabella's status as the queen and mother of the heir gave their cause a royal sheen the English people might rally behind. Mortimer, with his connections to disaffected barons and his battlefield credibility, promised military might. While Isabella corresponded in cipher and gold, quietly building a coalition of Flemish mercenaries and sympathetic nobles, Mortimer mapped the invasion. They were methodical, quiet, lethal in their synergy, not storming in righteous fury, but subduing England with a whisper first, a sword later. To the crown, their movements looked insignificant. A woman in exile, a disgraced nobleman, letters crisscrossing the channel. But beneath that calm surface, revolution stirred. In their hands, power ceased being a masculine birthright and became a weapon reshaped by necessity and love. Isabella would later be remembered as the she-wolf and Mortimer as the overreacher. But in these critical months, they were something rarer in medieval chronicles, a genuine partnership. Not a damsel rescued, nor a knight corrupted, but two broken figures binding their wounds to sharpen a blade, one both personal and political. Together, they would return to England not to beg forgiveness, but to demand reckoning. In the bitter winds of September 1326, a fleet of modest ships made landfall on the coast of Suffolk. Aboard them was not an army of brute force, but a coalition of outcasts, loyalists, and mercenaries led by a queen-turned strategist. Isabella, Clad in dark velvet embroidered with gold thread symbols of both mourning and majesty, stood at the prow with Roger Mortimer beside her, the salt spray whispering rebellion into the air. Their numbers were small, yet their arrival triggered waves across the English landscape. The people, weary from years under the tyrannical grasp of Hugh Despencer the Younger and the faltering leadership of Edward II, did not resist. They welcomed Isabella not as an invading force, but as a saviour. Local lords pledged fealty almost immediately. Town gates opened, fortresses surrendered without a fight. The nation was aching for change, and a mother fighting for her son's birthright stood centre stage. From London to Bristol, Edward II's once loyal nobles began to abandon him. His paranoia deepened as news of defections poured in. Despencer's grip tightened, but the harder they clung, the more fractured the regime became. Eventually, Edward fled westward in disguise, dragging Despencer with him like an anchor in a sinking ship. They were pursued not by brute force, but by the tide of justice Isabella had unleashed. When Despencer was captured, Isabella's resolve was tested. The man who had stolen years of her freedom was now shackled before her, trembling in defiance. In one of the most chilling episodes of her campaign, Despencer was executed in a gruesome spectacle, hanged, drawn, and quarter-readers Isabella watched with a face carved from stone. It was not revenge, but a political message, that tyranny would no longer wear the mask of royal privilege. Edward II was soon found and taken into custody. Still king in name, but no longer in reality, he was brought before his own parliament. Under mounting pressure, and with no army to defend him, he was forced to abdicate in January 1327. His crown passed not to a rival noble, but to his son Edward III, only 14. Isabella stood beside the boy, not just as his mother, but as the regent of England. In that moment, the child queen traded away as ransom decades earlier stood at the apex of power. Edward III, once disregarded, was unmade. Isabella, once silenced, now spoke through royal decree, reshaping the court, the crown, and the future of a kingdom. 1327. A new king is crowned Edward III, just a boy of 14. But England's true power rests in the hands of his mother, Isabella of France. Once a political pawn and neglected queen, she now stands as regent, flanked by her co-ruler and lover, Roger Mortimer. For the first time in her life, Isabella is not merely surviving the brutal intricacies of court politics, she is commanding them. Their regency begins with promise. After years of misrule under Edward II and the tyranny of Hugh Despencer, Isabella and Mortimer inherit a weary kingdom. They act decisively. Unpopular wars are halted. Edward II is quietly disposed of his mysterious death. Still, a subject of whispered rumour, and the realm begins to breathe again. Isabella governs in a way few queens ever have. Royal writs bear her seal. Ambassadors who once ignored the queen consort now bow before a sovereign in all but name. She meets with nobles, oversees councils, and manages the treasuries. Gone is the glittering but silenced girl queen. In her place, a woman of sharp intellect and unmistakable authority. She wears her widow's veil like a battle standard, mourning the past, declaring her control over the present. But power, for a woman, especially a foreign-born queeness, always a fragile crown. Even as peace returns and administration improves, murmurs, stirring court shadows, nobles grumble about Mortimer's rising wealth and titles. Some speak of the queen's influence as unseemly, unnatural, even dangerous. The same lords who had trembled before Hugh Despencer now whisper about Isabella with equal fear. To Isabella, the hypocrisy is infuriating. What man wouldn't rule in his son's stead if the throne passed early? What man wouldn't reward a loyal ally? But she is no man, and the court makes no effort to forget it. The same ambition that once rescued a kingdom now marks her as a she-wolf, not for cruelty, but for outgrowing submission. Still, she presses on. As Mortimer raises castles and asserts control over Wales, Isabella focuses on diplomacy and stability. Foreign relations are mended. France kept at arm's length, the Scots watched with careful eyes. But beneath her composed exterior, the Queen sees the shifting winds. Her son is growing. Edward III, once pliant and under her wing, now listens with narrowed eyes. He is no longer the child she defended. He is a king in waiting, restless, questioning. And as Isabella knows better than anyone, power does not yield peacefully, not even to the mother who secured it. The autumn of 1330 shrouded Nottingham Castle in uneasy silence. Shadows clung tightly to the corridors of stone as Edward III, just 18, prepared to sever the last tether of his boyhood. For 3 years, his mother, Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, had ruled England in his name. What had begun as a just rebellion against tyranny had festered into something else, a regency veiled in control, suspicion, and the echo of tyranny anew. Mortimer had grown increasingly autocratic, hoarding power, amassing land, and alienating nobles who had once stood alongside him during the campaign against Edward II. Meanwhile, Isabella, who once wielded strategy like a sword, found herself entangled in courtly indulgence and political miscalculations. Her once venerated image of the mother-saviour began to tarnish. Whispers at court hinted that the she-wolf had grown complacent or worse, blind to Mortimer's overreach. But her son had not. On an October night, Edward III, still in the armour of a prince but with the resolve of a king, launched a silent coup. With loyal knights he trusted implicitly, he infiltrated Nottingham Castle through a secret tunnel, the Mortimer Gate, an ironic tool of his enemy's own design. Tense candles flickered as the young monarch, his face pale with purpose, entered the Queen's private apartment. Isabella, startled from sleep, watched as her son motioned past her with a gesture that was not quite cruel, but irrevocably final. "Mother," he said, his tone formal and heavy with inheritance, "it ends tonight." Mortimer, roused in confusion, was seized, weaponless and speechless. The days that followed were swift and grim. Mortimer was publicly denounced, dragged before Parliament, and executed without the dignity of a noble death-hanged like a common criminal. Isabella, however, was spared. Perhaps out of reverence, perhaps mercy, but her punishment bore a different blade. She was stripped of power, of lands, of the voice that had once commanded armies. She faced her son not as a queen, but as a mother accused. Historical rumours whisper of her falling to her knees before him, pleading not for her crown, but for her life. Edward granted it, but sent her far from court to Castle Rising, a palace turned prison cloaked as retirement. Political exile became her new realm. There, amidst echoing halls and embroidered memories, Isabella faded from governance. Her fate sealed not by rebellion, but by succession. Majesty became memory, power a ghost, and for the first time in decades, England belonged to a king without a mother to guide or to reign. Isabella of France spent the final third of her life away from the thunderous clamour of court and power, cloaked instead in what history has come to call her decades in shadow. After the swift and decisive coup by her son, Edward III, in 1330, Isabella was not thrown into a dungeon, nor systematically vilified as might have been expected for a deposed regent and co-conspirator. Instead, she was retired quietly to Castle Rising in Norfolk, a place of both exile and strange peace. The stone walls of Castle Rising were thick enough to muffle gossip, but not memory. Isabella, scarcely past 40, living in semi-seclusion, turned her energies inward. The woman once clad in the armour of strategy and vengeance now walked hallways lined with tea, tapestries, rather than banners of war. Her robes grew darker, exchanging the opulent silks of court life for the restrained dignity of widow's garb and religious habit. Strings of prayer beads replaced jewelled necklaces. Her once guarded eyes dimmed with age, but not with regret. Time softened the fierce edges of her legacy, even as it exacted other tolls. She remained forbidden from formal politics, but she was not banished from royal life entirely. Isabella was occasionally permitted to attend court ceremonies, escorted with quiet formality. There, she would sit neither in disgrace nor prominentia presence from another era, like a ghost delicately stitched into the fringes of royal pageantry. Her relationship with Edward III stabilised over time. What began as a rupture son, overthrowing his own mother's will, matured into a distant but respectful reconciliation. He granted her a generous annual income and allowed familial visits. Edward had seized power from her, yes, but he did not erase her. Perhaps he understood that he owed his own crown in part to the cunning that now lay cloaked in quietude at Castle Rising. Wounded, but still regal, Isabella committed herself to acts of charity and devotion. She supported nearby convents, wrote letters rich in spiritual reflection, and hosted occasional visitors who remembered her as the queen who once ruled nations. To some, she became a cautionary tale. To others, a figure of tragic strength. In 1358, in the quiet of Castle Rising, Isabella died. Around her lay tokens of a life begun and defined in power's cruel orbit. Most haunting of all was the detail noted by her ladies-in-waiting. At her death, she wore her wedding dress, gold thread dulled by time, a faded symbol of empire and expectation and of the little girl who'd once trembled beneath its weight. History rarely grants women the final word, especially women who dared to wield power in a world built to shatter them. Isabella of France lived in that shadow. For centuries, she was reduced to a singular, damning epithet: she, Wolf of France, a phrase that evoked treachery, unnatural ambition, and cold femininity gone awry. Chroniclers painted her as a conniving temptress, a faithless wife, a predator to English kings. But beneath this legacy of infamy lies the far more human and more haunting truth of a queen who refused to be silenced. Modern historians have begun to peel back the layers of myth and misogyny that enshrouded Isabella's memory. She was not purely villain nor victim, but both and more. Her story, carefully reconstructed through letters, parliamentary records, and rare glimpses from behind medieval veils, reveals a woman of extraordinary political acumen, caught in a world that demanded she submit or disappear. Instead, Isabella endured. She existed in contradiction. A girl, child used as diplomatic currency, a mother who masterminded her husband's deposition for the sake of her son, a queen consort turned regent, then but never truly destroyed. In an age where women were rarely allowed to lead without becoming monsters in the eyes of men, Isabella's determination became her greatest sign and her greatest strength. The term she-wolf may reflect more on the anxieties of the chroniclers than on Isabella herself. A wolf is not always a predator. Sometimes a wolf is fiercely protective. Her role in dethroning Edward II was not reckless vengeance, but calculated necessity. Her regency, while controversial, brought fleeting stability to a fractured realm. And yet, Isabella's rise came at a cost. The very power she fought for ultimately became her undoing. Her relationship with Mortimer, her uncompromising rule, and the dangers of ruling in a man's world all conspired toward her fall. Her son's coup was not just political, it was generational, a final reassertion of patriarchal order. In her final decades, she faded into dignified silence. And yet, her presence remained a ceremonial figure draped in widow's cloth, attending coronations, visiting monasteries, still cloaked in royal dignity. Isabella's life is more than scandal or revolution. It is a mirror that shows how medieval power consumed those it could not control, especially women who dared to command it. She was not a monster. She was not a martyr. She was a woman who broke the rules and paid the price. Her story, once buried under centuries of blame, has become something new. A cautionary saga, a feminist resurrection, an unforgettable shadow queen who outlasted the myths.